having to lie, I feel, is the saddest and the ugliest part of being a homosexual. When you have your first bad love experience, for instance, and you can't go to your brother or your sister and say, I'm hurting.
While the effects of the Stonewall Uprising in Greenwich, New York, late in the night of June 27, 1969, were neither acknowledged nor appreciated until many years after, the police raid gone awry was the unspoken turning point in the fight for gay rights, since the popularity of the event within the LGBTQ community set into motion the unity of queer individuals throughout the U.S. to fight back.
It is no secret that people identifying as LGBTQ have been mistreated by society for centuries. Dating back to the 1700s, homosexuality was outlawed, being punishable by death. In the United States, homosexuality was deemed a psychiatric disorder, which was treated by electroshock therapy and other inhumane treatments, with severe cases being cured with lobotomies. Psychiatric wards quickly filled up with those who were suspected to be homosexuals.
What was called the Lavender Scare by the media was in full swing nearing the 1950s. Many cases emerged from this time of homosexuals being beaten in the streets and killed for quote-unquote indecent advances. This was a common excuse at the time for inflicting violence against LGBTQ people.
However, there were some escape for people who were gay. In major cities such as New York, Philadelphia, and many others, bars were a common place where gay people could meet together and not have to worry about the possible backlash for being themselves. Though this was not entirely safe, police raids were extremely common, and despite many people not committing any crimes of any sort, they were arrested and given a nickel ride.
This led to tensions between the LGBTQ community, which at the time had very few resources and groups, and the police. All of this culminated late into the night on June 27, 1969. There was a bar named the Stonewall Inn in Greenwich Village, which was also known as the Village. Due to the normalcy of police raids, there were warnings made by the bars. On the day of the riots, a police raid started and a warning sign was given. However, after the police began harshly treating some of the patrons, those who had been expelled began to stand up for one another.
Raymond Castro, a gay man who was 28 at the time, was at Stonewall with his friend. He told his story of his experience during the Stonewall riots to PBS. Castro had been taken out of the bar, but his friend was still stuck inside since he had no ID. When Castro went to help, he was, quote, pushed back into the stone wall by these plainclothes cops, and they would not let me back out. He goes on to recall that, quote, at that point, they wouldn't let anybody out. It was like a hostage situation. The people who were outside the bar began to see what was going on, and the people inside Stonewall started to get arrested by the police. Castro states that he resisted his arrest and remembers, quote, acting on impulse.
Many other people who were at Stonewall recall it being a time of confusion. Innocent people were being put into police vans that were already full. Yvonne Ritter, who was about to graduate high school during the riots, stated to PBS, "There were already more people than could fit in the vans, so when they opened the doors to put some drag queens in, some of the other people and I skipped out." Many people, along with Ritter, escaped from the site of the forming riot while they still could. Others, such as Mark Siegel, came back to help once the riots became more intense. Siegel wrote in his book, And Then I Danced, "We walked up and down Christopher Street, and 15 minutes later we heard loud banging and screaming. The screams were not of fear, but resistance."
Over the next couple of days, many police and law enforcement officers would come to the bar to contain the riots. However, the patrons of the bar had other plans. This is how Mark Siegel describes it.
Whoever threw the first brick. Well, there really wasn't a brick. There were coins, stones, maybe cans that were on the ground, what have you. It was whatever we could pick up at that point. There was nothing being built in the area, so there were no bricks. And then there's the line of who threw the first brick. Well, it was spontaneous. No one person can be tracked to they threw.
Stonewall patrons fought hard to keep their bar safe. Some kids in the riots called Stonewall, quote, the only safe place in their lives. After an hour of this, police barricaded themselves inside the Stonewall building, waiting for more troops to arrive. The rioters continued to try to reclaim the bar, and eventually the police left with the people they had arrested. A day later, Stonewall reopened while supporters cheered and celebrated, shouting gay power. After the riots, the bar became a safe place for LGBTQ+ people to come and gather safely.
The impacts of these riots was felt by those who participated at the time. Danny Garvin said while recalling his experience to PBS, quote, "You don't forget seeing Molotov cocktails being thrown and kids with blood coming down their faces." Another member of the community, Howard Smith, provided an outsider's perspective. Quote, "There were police cars and it got bigger by the minute. It looked like a whole lot of people who had no more idea of what was going on than me had immediately joined in. Every member of the then small-scale LGBTQ+ community felt the immediate impacts whether they attended the riots or not."
However, at the time, the event was overlooked by the media. Most local news stations didn't even cover the riots, with most mainstream newspapers not even touching the topic until years later. Outlets that covered the event did more harm than good. 3 daily newspapers all conducted interviews only with the police and were taken out of context. The New York Times' first article about the Stonewall riots said that hundreds of young men went on a rampage in Greenwich Village shortly after 3 a.m. yesterday after a force of plain-clothed men raided a bar that the police said was well known for its homosexual clientele. The press covering it made it seem as though the rioters were to blame.
However, the gay community quickly spread the word. Michael Fader said to National Geographic, quote, "The bottom line was we weren't going to go away." And we didn't. Not long after the riots, gay people started to openly express themselves. 1 year after the riot, the first Pride Parade was held in New York City. It started on Christopher Street, where the bar was located, and ended in Central Park on June 28, 1970. It was the 1-year anniversary of Stonewall. At the time, however, this was not a celebratory event. While today's Pride Parades are festive with floats, feathers, and cheery marchers, the first Pride Parade was a courageous endeavor from the gay community. According to the New York Times, it was an act of desperate courage. It gave the community visibility that it didn't have before and was another humongous step in the right direction for the gay community. 2 years later, Mark Siegel and many more would start the first Philadelphia Pride Parade.
After the first Pride Parade, many cities started their own, even where homophobia was commonplace. With the gay rights movement blazing through America, things started to change. In 1973, homosexuality was removed from the American Psychiatric Association's list of mental illnesses. On November 8, 1977, Harvey Milk, an openly homosexual male, won a seat on the San Francisco Board of Supervisors, something that was unheard of for the time. Unfortunately, 1 year later, Harvey Milk was assassinated by Dan White. Dan was sentenced to only 7 years in prison for voluntary manslaughter, a verdict that brought on many more riots.
Controversy around homosexuals worsened in 1981, which was the start of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. The disease took the LGBTQ community by storm, with over 100,000 people passing away due to the disease in the 1980s alone. The public was told many times that only gay people can contract and spread the illness, which was disproved many times over. Research for HIV/AIDS was continually denied funding by the government until 1983. Despite this, the community strongly supported each other. They distributed pamphlets about the disease and ways to avoid it. The disease ramped up in about 1985 and 1986, with more people being infected in those years than the previous years combined. In 1995, a ban was placed on homosexuals donating blood, and the ban wasn't lifted until 2023. This epidemic still continues to this day, however, numbers are declining.
Despite the backing behind the LGBTQ movement, homophobia was still prevalent. There was a public stigma around homosexuals, with many anti-gay movements also taking form. Politicians still disagreed with the homosexual way of life, but the LGBTQ community continued to make big strides towards equality and acceptance. Mark Siegel, who himself is a major figure in the community, told us about its many accomplishments.
I'll tell you that in New York 2019, for Stonewall 50, we had 4 million people.
Yeah.
So from 100 to 4 million, that's sort of amazing. And then if you go around the world, there's almost no place in the world where there's not pride. So imagine this. So what came from that year? A whole community. From a riot, we built a community.
In conclusion, the riots at Stonewall were the catalyst that lit the flame for the LGBTQ community. It started as a small riot that no one thought anything of and escalated into a nationwide community. Today, LGBTQ people can be themselves without retribution for the way they feel. There are now hundreds of organizations that support the LGBTQ instead of criticizing them.
So Aquarius let the sunshine in.
Yes.
So literally, it is the only song that I can actually say I recall dancing to in Stonewall.